A tiny skeleton lay curled in the dark. 78,000 years ago, someone dug a shallow pit deep inside a cave in Kenya, placed a child inside, and covered the body by hand. The bones were still in anatomical order when excavators found them. The child's head rested on what the sediment record suggests was a soft organic pillow. Someone tucked a dead child in like they were sleeping. That is not disposal. That is something else entirely. And the question of what it is will change how you see your own rituals, your own grief, and every funeral you have ever attended. A tiny body curled like a sleeping child, red ochre dust staining the surrounding earth. No water damage. No predator scatter. The bones sitting in anatomical order, the surrounding stones moved with intention. That pattern points to one thing: deliberate care, and you feel the pull of it immediately, because this overturns the idea that ancient people simply disposed of their dead. Researchers from the National Research Center on Human Evolution in Spain published the findings in Nature in 2021. The team named the child Mtoto, the Swahili word for child. What they found inside that pit was not an accident of geology or the work of predators or water. The pit showed cut marks in the substrate, a clear sign of deliberate digging. Micromorphology, the microscopic analysis of sediment layers, revealed distinct lenses of backfill. Someone scooped earth out, placed the child inside, and pushed the earth back in. Red ochre dusted the surrounding soil. Small stones sat near the skull. That combination, cut pit plus articulated skeleton, plus deliberate backfill, plus ochre, is what archaeologists call the convergent signature of intentional burial. Every single test pointed the same direction. This was a decision, a costly, deliberate, emotionally loaded decision. And it raises a question your brain will not easily release. Why bother? You might assume the answer is purely spiritual. You might assume ancient people buried their dead because they believed in something beyond death. That assumption is reasonable. It is also incomplete. Practical pressure-shaped funerary choices long before belief systems left any trace in the record. A body left in a camp attracts predators. It spreads disease. It creates hazard for the living. Removing it was not only emotionally motivated, it was survival logic. But the Mtoto burial was not a quick removal. Someone carried that child deep into a cave. Someone dug a pit. Someone added a pillow, ochre, and stones. That sequence of acts costs time, energy, and emotional labor, and it goes far beyond predator avoidance. Researchers who study mortuary behavior across cultures and across deep time have identified something consistent. Burial does two things simultaneously. It manages the immediate biological risk of death, and it creates a place, a permanent, revisitable location where the living can return, remember, and reinforce their obligations to one another. That place is the key. The grave is not just for the dead. The grave is a social technology for the living, and you have been using it your entire life without knowing its 78,000-year origin. But here is where your assumptions about ancient people start to break down. Modern humans did not invent burial. The evidence refuses to let us claim that cleanly. Ralph Selecki excavated Shanidar Cave in northern Iraq across the 1950s and 60s and recovered the remains of at least 10 Neanderthals. Near one skeleton, designated Shanidar 4, his team found dense clusters of pollen grains pressed into the sediment around the body, flowers on a Neanderthal grave. Selecki and pollen analyst Arlette Leroy-Gourhan interpreted those grains as the degraded remains of blooms placed deliberately on the body. Think about what that means. A species with a differently shaped skull, a different vocal tract, a brain wired in ways we still do not fully understand, looked at a dead member of its group and chose beauty as a response to loss. Not everyone accepted it. In 1999, researcher Jeffrey Sommer published an analysis in the Journal of Archaeological Science arguing that a burrowing rodent, specifically the Persian jerd, was responsible for concentrating pollen near the skeleton. Natural processes, he argued, could explain everything. Two interpretations, same physical evidence. One of them means Neanderthals mourned. The other means researchers wanted them to. Then in 2015, Emma Pomeroy of Cambridge University went back into Shanidar Cave and found a new, partial Neanderthal skeleton directly above the original finds. Clusters of flowering plant material, again, compressed into the sediment, again near the body. Pomeroy's team called for further analysis before drawing conclusions. They knew the stakes. Because if the flowers were deliberate, the implication reaches further than most people are prepared to go. Neanderthals survived on this planet for 300,000 years before disappearing roughly 40,000 years ago. If they mourned, the capacity for grief as a social act did not begin with your species. It began in a lineage that is no longer here to tell you about it. That thought is not comfortable. It is not supposed to be. Then the story gets stranger still. A brain the size of a large orange, smaller than a chimpanzee's relative to body size, navigating pitch-black cave passages so narrow that modern researchers with specialized equipment struggle to enter them, carrying bodies repeatedly into the dark. In 2023, Lee Berger and his team at the Rising Star Cave System in South Africa argued that Homo naledi, that small-brained hominin, had been deliberately depositing its dead deep inside those chambers. Grave-like depressions cut into the cave floor. Bones distributed in patterns suggesting repeated, intentional placement. Faint marks on cave walls the team interpreted as deliberate engravings. A creature with a brain one-third the size of yours performing funerary ritual. Christoph Zolikofer, Maria Martinan Torres, and Tim White pushed back hard. Dating incomplete, pit geometry ambiguous, wall marks not demonstrably symbolic. Several teams called for open samples, shared protocols, and independent replication before the claim could stand. This is where the evidence sits today. Unresolved, contested, alive. But the question it forces on you does not wait for the evidence to settle. If a brain one-third your size was capable of something resembling ritual, what exactly is the link between intelligence and the impulse to honor the dead? You assumed that link required a modern human brain. The Rising Star Cave suggests that assumption may be wrong. And if it is wrong, the origins of meaning run far deeper into the past than your species ever imagined. Here is the test that separates genuine burial from a body that simply fell into a hole. Archaeologists require 4 converging lines of evidence, and the last one is the most decisive: a cut pit, articulated bones in deliberate position, sediment that records digging and refilling under the microscope, and associated materials, ochre, objects, stones, placed with clear intent. When all 4 align, natural processes cannot explain what you are looking at. When only 1 or 2 align, you are in the territory of wishful thinking, but natural processes can imitate ritual. That is why multiple converging tests exist. That is why the Homo naledi debate is still open. And that is why the Sungur burial in Russia, which cleared every single test, still stops researchers cold 34,000 years later. Consider what deliberate burial looked like at its most extreme. 34,000 years ago at Sungir in Russia, 2 adolescents were buried head to head in a single grave. When excavators uncovered them, they found the bodies covered in a quantity of ornamentation that stunned the field and has not been fully explained since. Over 10,000 individually carved mammoth ivory beads, fox-tooth pendants, ivory lances, pierced animal teeth. Every object had been made by hand, one at a time, from raw material that required hunting to obtain. Researchers Eric Trinkhaus and Alexandra Buzilova estimated in 2018 that carving a single mammoth ivory bead required between 1 and 2 hours of skilled labor. Multiply that by 10,000 beads. You are looking at somewhere between 10,000 and 20,000 hours of manufacturing labor buried in a single grave. That is the equivalent of one person working full-time every day for 5 to 10 years, producing nothing but grave goods. No society buries that scale of resource in the dead without a compelling social reason. The Sungur burial was not just an act of grief. It was a public declaration. It told everyone who witnessed it exactly how significant these 2 individuals were, or how significant the people burying them needed to be, or both. The dead were being used to communicate something powerful to the living. That logic is not ancient history. You saw it last week. Every elaborate funeral you have ever attended was doing exactly what Sungir did 34,000 years ago. The medium changed. The message did not. Here is the part that will stay with you. Burial did not just solve the problem of what to do with a body. Burial created something that had not existed before in human social life. It created a fixed, permanent, geographically anchored memory of a person. Before permanent burial, memory of the dead traveled only as long as the people who carried it stayed alive and stayed together. Mobile groups lose their dead to time and distance. A grave stops that process. A grave says this person was here, and the people who loved this person will return to this spot. Those returns became rituals. Those rituals became obligations. Those obligations became the connective tissue of early human social networks. Researchers, including anthropologist Paul Bond, have documented how burial sites across the world function as territorial anchors, as meeting points for dispersed kin groups, as locations for seasonal feasting and alliance formation. You inherit every bit of that. When your family returns to a grave site, you are performing an act whose social function has not changed in 78,000 years. You are reinforcing your obligations to the living by honoring the dead. You are maintaining the network. Graves across the world look wildly different. Some show delicate beadwork, careful placement, red ochre staining. Others show monumental tombs filled with objects meant to travel with the dead. Climate, mobility, social rank, and ideas about ancestors all shaped what people did. Spectacular graves are the exception, not the rule. Most people across ancient history were laid in simple pits with a few belongings that matched their daily life. Archaeologists warn that ornate tombs tell us about rare social roles more than about every household. Ancient people did not all bury their dead in the ground. The record documents sky burial, the practice of leaving bodies on elevated platforms for birds and weather to process, documented across Central Asia, the Americas, and Aboriginal Australia. Excarnation, the deliberate removal of flesh from bone before final disposal, appears across Neolithic Europe. Secondary burial, where bones are collected months or years after death and reburied, was common across Southeast Asia and the ancient Near East. Cremation appears in the record as early as 17,000 years ago at Lake Mungo in Australia, where a young woman's burned and crushed bones were buried in a formal deposit. What all of these practices share is not a method. What they share is deliberateness. Someone made a choice. That choice reflected what the dead owed the living and what the living owed the dead. The method varied. The obligation never did. Imagine a smoke-lit chamber, small hearth throwing long shadows on damp walls, a single figure kneeling, setting a body down, dusting it with ochre, stones placed like markers, voices humming low around the fire, hands moving slowly, as if rehearsing how to remember. That scene is not a reconstruction of one burial. It is a reconstruction of a pattern that repeats across every continent and across hundreds of thousands of years of human and pre-human history. The specific gestures changed. The underlying logic did not. Burial turned loss into the glue of society. It removed a hazard and made a place. That place bound the living to obligations and stories that outlived any single life. Those obligations became a glue for cooperation, made trust possible across seasons and generations, and turned individual loss into a public fact that a community could act on. The question we started with was simple. What did ancient humans do when someone died? They did what you do. They gathered. They made decisions about the body. They invested labor and emotion in a ritual that served both the dead person's memory and the living community's cohesion. They created a place to return to. They used that place to reinforce who they were to one another. What is surprising is not that they did these things. What is surprising is how early the evidence pushes. 78,000 years ago at Pangaya CAD, possibly 60,000 years ago at Shanidar if the flowers were deliberate, possibly earlier still if the rising star evidence holds. Your social instincts, your rituals, your impulse to mark loss and maintain memory trace back to choices made in caves and open camps by people who had none of the things you associate with civilization. They had grief. They had community. They had the understanding that a death was not just a biological event. It was a social one, and it required a social response. Think about your own rituals. Think about who you remember and how your family marks loss. That way of holding grief did not begin with your culture or your religion or your century. The next episode examines how those obligations shaped law, property, and ancestor politics across the ancient world. But carry this with you first. Civilization did not create the funeral. The funeral created civilization.